Hello, I'm Tom Gregory with Youngstown Christian Television. Thanks for joining us on the YouTube channel here and watching the program that you're about to see. Before you do that, if you could hit the subscribe button and join us, that way you'll always be informed of what's going on with Youngstown Christian Television every time we put a new video up on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, a program produced by Youngstown Christian Television. And in this program, we attempt to integrate the biblical record with the ancient historical record and see where they overlap, where they influence one another, and how God's story is told throughout those different periods of history. So far, we've been looking at the beginning of the earth. We've looked at the first civilization in Sumer and the civilization that came after it in the old Babylonian Empire. If you've missed any of those episodes, or if you would like to get an outline that you can follow along with in watching the episodes and take some notes, then go to the website and scroll down to Discovering His Story, and you will find all of that there. Now, last time we were looking at the Old Babylonian period, the Old Babylonian kingdom, which were essentially the Amorites that came into Sumer and conquered Sumer. And the most famous king of that reign was Hammurabi. Hammurabi is known for his law code, and we talked about that, its similarities and differences last time to the Mosaic Law. The picture that we have here shows Hammurabi receiving the blessing of the sun god. You see in the center picture at a distance, and then close up you can see that the picture there of Hammurabi receiving the blessing of the sun god Shamash. Now, moving on to looking at the other ideas that we can find out about the Old Babylonian kingdom, we've turned to the fact of its language. The language is called Akkadian, and Akkadian, because of the dominance of this Old Babylonian kingdom and of the people that spoke Akkadian, it became the common language throughout the Middle East at this time and beyond. The religion of the Old Babylonian kingdom, or the Amorites, were still shaped by the Sumerians. So much of what the Sumerians believed is passed on to what the Amorites believed in this Old Babylonian kingdom. The Mesopotamian pantheon then would contain some familiar names to the Sumerians. Many of them are pictured here, the gods of Babylon. We have Anu, the god of the sky and father of the gods, the archetypal king. We have Enlil, the Lord Storm, god of wind and storms, and the executive officer of the divine assembly. We have Ninurta, the son of Enlil, god of the plow. We have Ninhursag, the mistress of the foothills, the fertile slopes leading to the eastern mountains, or the lady who gives birth. We have Enki, or Ea, the Lord Earth, and god of the underground fresh waters. Inanna, earlier Ninana, also known as Ishtar, was mistress of the date clusters, mistress of heaven, the goddess of fertility and love, and the protector of harlots. We have Dumuzi, a shepherd god, who is Inanna's husband, mentioned in Ezekiel 8:14. And we have Ereshkigal, the queen of the greater earth, that is the underworld. And then lastly, Marduk, the young bull of the thunderstorms, the city god of Babylon. Marduk, the god of Babylon, became king of the gods. So we talked about all these before. But we want to go next to the story of creation that is found in this Old Babylonian period, and it is called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, we find the writing of it in this period of time but the origins of this story really can be traced back to the Sumerians. Like I said, much of what the old Babylonian Empire or the Amorites believed can be traced back to the Sumerians. And this Epic of Gilgamesh began there, but it was perpetuated then throughout not only the old Babylonian kingdom, but through many others as well. And so the story itself is very common throughout the ancient world. It's named for the main character, Gilgamesh, who seems to have been a king, a real king in the 3rd millennium BC, and was later venerated as a demigod. Enuma Elish, from the first 2 lines meaning when above, is an epic of creation and appears to be a myth corresponding to an annual ritual celebration of the first harvest in the spring called Akitu, and was popularized during the time of Hammurabi. One of the main purposes of the creation epic is to show the preeminence of Babylon over all the other cities of the country, and especially the supremacy of Marduk over all the other Babylonian gods. At the New Year's festival, the story of creation was recited, and a mock battle was fought in which the king played the role of the god who is victorious over the forces of chaos. The idea of a cosmic battle between a creator god and the forces of chaos, especially a dragon or sea monster, is common in the ancient Near East. Compare Baal's defeat of Yam, or the sea, in Canaanite myth, especially this. Though you did slay Lotan the fleeing, or primeval serpent, did make an end of the twisting or crooked serpent, the foul-fanged with 7 heads. And so that's talking about what happened in this battle with chaos that brought about the creation of the world. Now we see references of this in the Hebrew Bible as well, in places like Job 26, 12 and 13, where it says, "He quieted the sea with his power, and by his understand he shattered Rahab." Now Rahab is a name for the sea creature. "By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent." And in Psalm 74, 13 and 14, it says this, "You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea monsters in waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan." And again, Leviathan is that great sea monster. "You gave him food as for the creatures, you gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness." Then in Psalm 89, 9 to 10, it says, "You rule the swelling of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You yourself crushed Rahab like one who is slain. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm." So all these are relating God, the one true God, Yahweh, to the mythological stories that have been told about creation that comes from this time, this time period of the old Babylonian kingdom, or the ruling of the Ammonites. There's another passage in Isaiah 27:1, which uses the same words as the Canaanite myth. It says, "On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea." So these are words very similar to what we find in the creation account of Babylon. But it's not to say that the accounts given in the Epic of Gilgamesh are true. It's simply God using stories with which the people of Israel were familiar to demonstrate that what occurred at creation occurred because of what was accomplished by Yahweh God, their own true God. In fact, there was such a connection here, such a serious connection to the story of creation, that in Babylon, a king's coronation was postponed until the New Year's festival that celebrated this retelling of creation. The story of the flood can also be found in this work with the Sumerian Utnapishtim relating what he did in accordance with the commands of the god Ea. So I thought it'd be interesting for us to look at a comparison of the Epic of Gilgamesh with what occurs in the book of Genesis. So first of all, we see that in the Epic of Gilgamesh it says that on the 5th day I decided upon its plan. The floor was 200 foot square, the walls were 200 feet high. So you can see that the structure that was being built in this Epic of Gilgamesh was a square. It was a cube. But we see in Genesis 6 that Noah is told to make the length 300 cubits, the breadth 50 cubits, and the height 30 cubits. That was more of a rectangle. It says in the Gilgamesh epic, I gave it 6 stories and divided the breadth 7 times. Its interior I divided into 9. Looking over Genesis, verse 16, you shall make a window for the ark, finish it to a cubit from the top, set the door of the ark in the side of it, you shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. So both had divisions within that structure. Then in verse 14, going back in Genesis 6, you shall make the ark with rooms. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, it says 6 sar of bitumen I poured into the kiln. Now bitumen is a tar-like substance that was used throughout ancient times in the Middle East. And Noah was told that you shall cover it inside and out with pitch. It would have been the same material. The Epic of Gilgamesh continues, all that I had I loaded of the seed of all living things. What is Noah told? Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. Of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark to Noah by 2s, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And we see there on the left, the Epic of Gilgamesh says, I brought into the ship my whole family and kinsfolk. It goes on to say, in Gilgamesh, the cattle of the field, the beasts of the field, all craftsmen, I made them go up into it. So Gilgamesh apparently included a lot more of the than his own family in coming into what we might call the ark. He said, I went into the ship and closed my door. What happened with Noah? It says, the Lord closed the door behind him. Gilgamesh says, as soon as a gleam of dawn shone in the sky, came a black cloud from the foundation of heaven. Inside it, Adad thundered. Noah tells us, it came about after the 7 days, or Moses tells us about Noah, that the water of the flood came upon the earth. On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. Gilgamesh tells us, Adad's rage reached to the heavens, turning all light into darkness. We're told by the Epic of Gilgamesh that the gods of Mesopotamia were actually terrified by the flood, and they fled to the upper reaches of heaven, where the god Anu has his abode. Before they enter, they crouch and cower like dogs. They were grieved and shattered by what is happening, and tearfully and in utter rejection or dejection lodge their complaint. But the flood rages on unceasingly, as Gilgamesh learns. 6 days and nights, Gilgamesh says, raged the wind, the flood, the cyclone devastated the land. When the 7th day came, the cyclone, the flood, the battle was over. Interesting that in Gilgamesh it's 7 days for the flood, but why 7? 7 is a number that is used often in the Old Testament to indicate completion, perfection. And here it finds its way into the Epic of Gilgamesh as the time length which the flood lasted. When the 7th day came, the battle was over, we're told, which had battled like an army. The sea became calm. The cyclone died away. The flood ceased. What are we told in Genesis 8? But God remembered Noah, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. He goes on to say in chapter 8, also the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed, and the rain from the sky was restrained, and the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. Over in Gilgamesh, he tells us that all mankind had turned to clay. The ground was flat like a roof. Then the flood came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark, that it rose above the earth. And I think I've got that in the wrong column. That should have been over in Genesis. So my mistake there. The water prevailed, increased greatly upon the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high heavens everywhere under the heavens were covered. And that should have been back in the earlier column on the right of Genesis. But one thing we can point out from here is that we're told that all the high mountains were covered with this flood. This was not a local flood. I won't get into all the details of the discussion there, but how could it have been a local flood if we're told that all the high mountains were covered? If we're told that Noah had to gather 2 of every kind of animal, that he had to spend 100 years building a boat. If there was a local flood, why didn't God just tell Noah, go over the next ridge where there is no flood? Why save all these animals? There's animals over there. You know, it just doesn't make sense at all within the biblical record. And I would say even in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it doesn't make sense. One author believed that I read believed that the previous line must have been based upon eyewitness account. That line about the ground being flat like a roof, all mankind turned to clay. He said no one but an eyewitness could have understood its meaning, because no one in all the civilizations that perpetuated this myth would have understood what it meant that all mankind had turned to clay. He says, quote, only someone who had himself seen the desolation caused by the catastrophe could have described it with such striking force. The great layer of mud, which covered every living thing like a shroud and leveled the ground until it was as flat as a roof, must have been seen with his own eyes by someone who had had a marvelous escape. So, was the Epic of Gilgamesh at least influenced by someone who had actually seen the devastation? Next we're told in Gilgamesh, I opened the window and the light fell on my face. What are we told in Genesis? Then it came about at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made. In Gilgamesh it tells us the ship lay upon Mount Nisir. Mount Nisir held the ship and allowed it not to move. In Genesis, it tells us that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. So a difference in names of the place, but who knows whether Nisir is the name of a place in the mountains of Ararat, because Gilgamesh tells us a specific mountain, whereas in Genesis we're told a range of mountains and not the specific one in which it rested. Well, I hope you found that interesting to compare the Epic of Gilgamesh with what Moses has written for us in the book of Genesis concerning the flood of Noah. Now let's continue on looking at the Old Babylonian kingdom, the kingdom of the Amorites, and consider their contributions. Some of them are reflective of what they got from Sumer, and some are some innovations. So first of all, in the area of trade, because they had expanded the area of Sumer and had captured more cities, built more cities, they were on the rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, into the Persian Gulf, and they expanded the trade that had been there previously. They also innovated in the areas of algebra and geometry, and the areas of astronomy and astrology. In fact, they identified astronomical regularities such as the Tropic of Cancer. They called it the line of Enlil. The Tropic of Capricorn, they called the line of Ea. And the ecliptic, or the crossing line, approximately the orbit of Jupiter. So, think about it. This is ancient times. This is thousands of years before Christ. And yet they're accomplishing these great understandings within the areas of astronomy and astrology. All of these elements are incorporated into the form of the flood story that we have in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Mesopotamian astronomers organized the belt of stars around the celestial equator into the 12 major divisions we know as the zodiac. In addition, each zodiacal division had three-way station stars 10 degrees apart. Jewish and other traditions used the Babylonian names of the months and their calendar system, which was able to keep the lunar calendar coordinated with the solar year. So there's the Babylonian mathematics and the astronomical achievements of the Babylonians. So they predicted solar and lunar eclipses, mapped Venus's cycle, etc. So much more advanced than we might have thought. Now, with all good things, it must come to an end. And so, as the old Babylonian kingdom continued for a certain length of time, eventually around 1700 BC, it began to weaken. And there was an Indo-Aryan ruling class from the north that invaded. These are called the Horites in the Bible, Horites. And they simply assimilated the civilization of Mesopotamia. They ruled from around 1700 to 1500 BC. Following them was another invasion, the Mitanni invasion, in which a union of small Hurrian principalities, that's Hurrian, came in, and they exercised control over the upper Mesopotamia and Syria. And eventually they fell to the Hittites and the Assyrians. Then there were invaders from the northeast, what we call Iran today, which brought a decline of culture and military power. Haran was one of the cities of this area, the city to which Abraham and his family went as they left Ur, probably to the north, and came down to Haran before traveling on into the land of Canaan, the promised land given to Abraham by Yahweh God. Now, we've looked at a lot of different issues concerning these early civilizations. We've looked at the very first civilization, according to secular historians, that of Sumer, although we would contend that there were civilizations prior to the flood. In fact, we might even think about the island of Atlantis that is extolled by some Greek historians. But at any rate, Sumer is the first one after the flood. And there are a lot of things that they came up with, a lot of inventions, we would call them, innovations, that simply, to me, tell us that they had information from civilizations prior to the flood, that it was passed down through oral tradition. And from Sumer, we found that they eventually were overtaken by a king, an Akkadian named Sargon, who was the first emperor because he conquered other cities around, creating an empire. And Sargon lived and ruled in the area of Mesopotamia for a number of years before another time of disintegration came. And then came into the land the Amorites, coming from the north, the Amorites, those descendants of Shem, coming in and taking over the area of Sumer, which had been populated by descendants of Ham. So we have more or less brown-skinned people coming and invading an area of black-skinned people. And they took that over. And the Amorites continued the civilization of the Sumerians. They're largely dependent on the Sumerians for their ideas about religion and culture. They continued those on and built upon it. And under the kingdom of the old Babylonians, or the Amorites, we have the story of Hammurabi, that great king who ruled over an empire and who also gave us a law code that was written, which was an improvement on the common way in which law was enforced, but definitely still had its drawbacks, favoring the wealthy over the common, having very harsh punishments for things that were not so terrible. And as we said, when Moses comes, there's an improvement with the Mosaic law that God gives over what had been given under Hammurabi. And as we've continued on to the Old Kingdom period, we have gone to another time of disintegration and other civilizations, other cultures, other peoples invading the area of Mesopotamia. And that's going to bring us for a while to the end of our study of the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. Next, we're going to go to another land that's extremely important to us, and that is the land of Egypt. We're going to answer questions like, who built the pyramids? Was it the Hebrew slaves? When did Joseph come to Egypt, and what effect did he have upon Egypt? Do we have any proofs of Joseph's presence in Egypt? You know, when did his family, the family of Jacob, of Israel, come to Egypt? And then what happened over those years? Why did they finally become enslaved? And then we have the rising of Moses. Do we know who the princess was that drew that baby out of the Nile River? Do we know what happened to him following that? What relationship did he have with the pharaohs, with the princess? What was it that drove him out of Egypt at a time when his people were suffering in the bonds of slavery? Where did he go? What did he do for 40 years before Yahweh appeared to him and told him to go back? Who was the Pharaoh when Moses made his way back to Egypt? And what happened during those 10 plagues? And why specifically did God send those plagues upon Egypt? What effect did it have upon Egypt? And then what happened when Moses led his people out? Where did they go next? Did they go to the place known today as Mount Sinai? Or is there another explanation, another location? We'll find out as we study Egypt in the weeks to come, as we look first of all at ancient Egypt before the rise of pharaohs, and then we'll look at the three main parts of Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And we'll find out that it's not only during those kingdom periods that many events occur, but also in between there's some pretty important events that are important to history and important even to the Hebrew people as they are in Egypt during some of those times. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation today looking at the Sumers and then the Old Babylonian Kingdom, or the Amorites, those relatives of Abram and of Israel. And I hope that if you missed any of the previous episodes that you will go to the website, go down to Discovering His Story, and log on there on to Discovering His Story, and then look for the previous episodes. Also look for the outline that is there, which will help you to keep track of where we are in the story. And as always, if you missed anything, you can always go back and watch the previous episodes. I hope that you will continue to be with us and tell your friends about this interesting look into ancient history through the eyes of the Bible, the eyes of what God says is important, and see how God was working through all these events to bring about His will. Remember, His ultimate goal from ancient times was to bring about the time of the Messiah, the time when the Messiah would come and be that seed that had been promised to Adam and Eve. See you next time.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Can we use science to prove that God created all that we have? How old is our world and the universe? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.